We're going to continue this topic of educating children, principles for becoming, and continue this line of self-determination, the kind of goal we're looking at when children are in their mid-teens, early 20s, which has three components: competency, autonomy, and relatedness. I'm going to add another feature today about the cumulative advantage and the early start, and let me explain why. Now, the way we're defining education is we're creating momentum for a life of growth and a life of becoming whatever it is someone can become, because that leads to a life of fulfillment, realizing your personal potential and also your social betterment, how you help others and benefit others. So it's not really education for a specific training or a specific attainment, although that certainly is a part of it, of becoming a certain kind of professional. But we cannot control all the factors. We hardly even know who our students are, what's inside of them, what interests are, what's going to blossom as they get into their teens and their 20s and they discover more about who they are. Furthermore, we cannot control the circumstances that will affect the future and the future that they inherit. Things that can happen from without, externally, can change all the plans we might have had for whatever attainment of profession we hope them to have. But what we can do across the board, no matter what field somebody enters, is we can nurture these characteristics that create momentum for growth. You know, habituated behaviors, habituated attitudes, ways of thinking, and how to think. So that no matter what field they find themselves in or what environments they inherit, they are self-determined. They are internally driven to establish who they are, how they ought to live, and how they can contribute to the people who are around them. Life is in their hands. They're self-determined as much as possible. So whatever settings and situations that they are given, they're equipped, again, with these behaviors, these habituated habits of thinking and the development of their attitudes to forge their own growth whenever and wherever it has to take place. And it's their own becoming. And in fact, it also creates in them a stretching forward to always live on a higher plane of life. I think that's the aspiration of any educator, whether we're talking about a teacher with students or we're talking about the parent educator. You'd like to see your children have an attitude to live on a higher plane, to give them opportunities where they can stretch farther than we have. Now, so when we create this momentum, we're always examining many of the characteristics of people we consider have a self-determined life. And then you work backwards. You know, what are the components to put in place? What's the education? What is the training? What are the experiences that will foster the development of all these qualities? And this is where I introduce this two phrases. One is the cumulative advantage, and the other is the early start. They kind of go together. And what you're basically doing is you're giving children the advantages of good habits, developing whatever skills they have, training their thinking at an early age. And over time, the advantages, where there's practice upon practice upon practice, month after month, year after year, there is a cumulative advantage that gives them a greater advantage in life. A few examples. One is very popular these days is in the realm of reading. And what they've shown is children who have an early start in being exposed to vocabulary, literature at a young age, they're read to, there's lots of conversations at home, cultivating talking, cultivating listening. They enter kindergarten with anywhere from 4,000, 4,500 words, vocabulary words that are theirs, that they can use, they understand. Whereas another child who has not had that advantage for whatever reason, there hasn't been a place of rich conversation, there hasn't been a place of rich literature at home, they may enter kindergarten with 400 to 500 words as their vocabulary. There's a cumulative advantage. by the time you reach the 5th grade or the 4th grade, that accumulation continues. And they found the gap between those with that early advantage and keep building on it, and those without that advantage, and it's harder and harder to build on it, becomes a disadvantage. The gap is huge. In fact, much of the push for preschool education in the country follows this kind of understanding of the lack that is in many children when they enter school. The world of sports understands this, the cumulative advantage of giving children training at a young time. Whether you agree with it or not is beside the point. Whether it's gymnastics or baseball, or like myself, I enjoy folk wrestling, high school and college wrestling. And the children who get an early start and they get training and practice, and the talents are developed, the talents are honed, by the time they're 14, 15, 16 years old, very difficult for a child who did not have that to enter into the sport at the same level of those who've had the cumulative advantage. It applies to music in the same way. Those who want to play in the Cleveland Youth Orchestra, it's kind of hard to get started when you're 11 or 12. Most of those kids have been playing since sometimes as early as 3, if they did Suzuki violin or piano. It applies across the board. Work habits are the same way. Children who are taught and trained over time, you have to work hard. You can't quit. You got to keep at it. My goodness, I've watched this a lot. The children who are under that kind of discipline from their teachers and from their parents, where they're at when they're 15, hard for a child when they're 14, hard for a child when they make a decision at age 14 or 15. By golly, I'm going to start working hard. It's hard to make that up. You don't have the habits. It's not been habituated. And so consequently, you have a sort of a disadvantage when it comes to work habits, because there is a cumulative advantage over time getting started early. It's called the cumulative advantage. It's also referred to as the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And I think that's sometimes a fact of life. I don't necessarily like it, but in fact, that's the way things work. And so when we're looking at creating self-determined young men and women, we're looking at giving them the advantage early that builds and builds and builds and builds. So when they get to their teens, when they get to their early 20s, they have established these attitudes, habits, and thinking skills that are going to make them excel. This is why in education, as we're defining it, which is creating momentum for growth, holds this idea of the early start. This is because we're cultivating. We're like gardeners in a garden with our flowers. The children are our flowers. And we're trying to create the conditions that will habituate their blossoming. So, we want good, strong roots, and we want to put fertilizer in the ground. All the things that will create an environment that will give them the foundation and the framework for a life of self-determination, a life of growing, and a life of becoming. This is the cumulative advantage. One time in an interview of a new family, they came in and we were talking about character development. And the father kind of poo-pooed me. He said, don't worry about that. They'll get that hard work and all that stuff when they're older. And I thought to myself, well, I can appreciate your opinion, but the science does not back that opinion. The science backs the cumulative advantage and an early start. So I hope this is a good setting to understand. Oftentimes, people will ask me about where their children should go to college or go to high school or whatever. And I'll sometimes offer the advice of, well, it's not that important where they go to high school or where they go to college, but what's important is who's going there. And what I mean by that is, if the attitudes and the skills and the habits have been cultivated, and you get a young man or a young woman, they're 15, headed off to high school, they're 18, they're headed off to college, but they have developed these skills and these outlooks toward life for growth, then no matter where they go or what they do, of course, there's always good schools who will take it a little bit further, but they're going to thrive because the habits are in place. There's been some cumulative advantage over time due to an early start, and this is part of their character to be this kind of person who is self-determined and ready to take on life and to grow.